Welcome back, everyone, to another new episode of Grow Your Path to Wellness. If you missed our last episode, we hosted Dr. Amy Sapola, and she talked all about regenerative farming, agriculture, and we kind of just touched on many different areas of that and how soil is important to our health and the nutrition and things and the types of foods we're eating, all of those things intertwined into holistic wellness. So if you missed that, make sure you go back and check that out. This week, we welcome Lauren Ammon. I've always been
Ammon, you got it.
All right, got it the first time. So we're excited to have her with us. And so from kindergarten in Northern Kentucky to college at Eastern Michigan University, Lauren swam her way to state, national, and collegiate conference championships before she finally hung up her suit and goggles and said goodbye to competitive swimming. It was a fun ride and she loved every minute of it, but she often struggled to maximize her mindset and emotional state to support her continued success. Lauren started Performance Reimagined because of Michael Phelps's message during the 2020 Olympics. Competition is overwhelming. We just want someone to talk to who listens and doesn't want to fix us. That was the eureka moment. Working with athletes is where she belongs. She created Performance Reimagined to support her current student athletes to train their minds like they train their bodies, to remove mental blocks that keep them from their full potential, both on and off the field. Welcome, Lauren. Thank you for being here, giving us some of your Sunday morning.
Oh, thank you guys so much, or ladies. Thank you so much for having me. I'm super excited, and I'm super interested in that episode you talked about with Doctor in the Soil. That I'm going to go back and check that out for sure.
It was so good. Lauren, thank you so much for being here. So Lauren and I recently met through our networking group, and she actually presented for us. So we have speakers come in like once a month from different chapters, and Lauren spoke on tackling the, I'm like, all right, what was the name again? I remember it, tackling the invisible opponent. And I remember from the moment you started talking, it was probably the first sentence or two you said, I was like, this is my jam. Like somebody that's not in the mental health field, trained that way, but gets it and is speaking, similar language to what we are and what we're trying to empower folks with. So I know Kelsi shared your bio and all of that. I love that you're here. Is there anything else you wanted to add other than what we shared about you of like why you're so passionate about this?
Well, I mean, all of this really stems from my own experience. And, while the business wasn't built to be around me, it really stems from that moment of feeling alone as an athlete in some respects, in terms of thinking I was the only one going through it, when it turns out, not at all. But at 16 and 17 years old, sometimes you don't necessarily have that awareness. And, in the athletic world, it is all about like, well, at least when I was growing up, put your head down, get through it, just, be tough. And so this is an opportunity to show that, yes, you can be tough, but a part of that equation involves vulnerability and opening up and figuring out how to really get through the things that are weighing you down internally so that you can perform to the best of your ability externally.
Okay, so let's get right into it. One of the first things you shared wanting to talk about is the value of mental training. And like you said, that's not typically talked about in sports. I mean, I'm sure maybe professional sports because, they're bringing in millions and they have trainers and all of these things, but definitely with like the students and let's talk about that. Why is mental training so important?
Well, yeah, I mean, you hear all these adages or these quotes of like, attitude is everything, or 90% of, performance is mental or attitude. And it's just quote unquote funny, right? That we say all these things, but then don't give a ton of credence or value to the mental side of the game, right? I mean, every athlete on the planet shows up to give 90 minutes, 2 hours, 2.5 hours, depending on the sport or whatever the case may be, depending on the day, to the mental side of the game. And to the physical side of the game. And a lot of times it's like, oh, well, you figure out the mental side. And that was always the message when I was growing up. And you kind of still hear it today, or what you kind of hear from coaches today is, I don't know how to do that. So it's like one of those things that just either maybe isn't ignored, but maybe isn't necessarily talked about to the depths that it requires. And it is a huge part of the game. And so it's super important to highlight it, to pinpoint it, and to give athletes the time and tools to figure out how to make it work for them, because it is such a huge part of performance, right? I mean, the physical part is all about gearing up and making sure your body's ready. But the moment that you're ready to step on that big stage, whatever, right now it's in March Madness, right? So you've got like these hundreds of kids stepping up to the biggest stages of their life. Yeah, they've prepared themselves physically, but when you're standing on that court in front of thousands and millions, potentially billions watching on TV, like that's a big moment. And if you haven't necessarily given your mental state the attention it deserves, your performance may not be what you want it to be, simply because no attention was given to the mental side of the game.
I remember middle school and part of high school, I played volleyball. And then when I was young, I did soccer. And I feel like it's one of those things where we put the motivational posters up about it, or
I literally imagine them like in the classrooms, like all those like yeah.
In my brain, I can see them in our locker room. I can see them in the hallways, but then they're giving you very practical skills and teaching the practical side of, like you said, Lauren, like gearing your body up, things to make sure we're doing. You hear the parents, like, you need to get good sleep tonight, and here's what we're going to eat. And no, we're not stopping and, eating this food on the way home because blah. Like, I feel like in our world, we're given more concrete, actionable things when it comes to the physical body. And Amanda and I can go on a whole tangent about how, but they're not separate, your mind and your body. But I do think as a world, we don't do the whole proactive and preventative emotional health, mental health.
Yeah. And I think part of that is because it's so nebulous, right? You can't measure it. You can't see it.
Yeah.
You can't measure it. You can't, if an athlete has an injury, right, the first thing is like, stay off it, let's make sure, we're taking care of your body. But the moment that there maybe is a crack, quote unquote, and the mental foundation or the emotional foundation, one, you can't see it. Two, there's like this, like, oh, you're fine, just move on, kind of thing. And then it's hard to measure. And so I think it's those kind of, those things are kind of quote unquote scary, right? To us is that, like, we want to talk about it, but when you can't have these tangible results, I think a lot of people are just like, oh, well, then we'll just move on. We won't give it attention.
I feel like it's met with like, and we'll get into the whole internal opponent and stuff, but I don't feel like people externally know how to deal with it. When that child or teen or young adult gets down on themselves, when their own inner opponent comes out, I feel like the only more common, I guess I only speak for my experience and what I see, even having brothers who played sports, it was met with another external opponent, not with skills, not with like, hey, how do we regulate? What do we do in this moment to kind of decenter or, not be so hard on ourselves? And it's just like, they're either kind of dismissed and validated or told you're fine, or you're ruining this for your whole team. Get it together.
Yeah. That very much is the message.
So I was so excited for today. And so it's super valuable. And can you make the connection for our community explain the connection between the mental training side and its connection with physical training and performance?
Yeah, well, it alludes to what you talked about before. They're not separate things, right? And, we're so interconnected. So when you think about it from a sports standpoint, right? One of the best analogies that I've given that athletes are like, oh, okay, I understand, is the idea that, your body will respond to the intensity of your thoughts, right? So I always use myself as an example. I was the biggest perfectionist on the planet when it came to swimming. Like every time I stepped on the block, it had to be perfect. I had to swim the best times I possibly could, even though, wildly unrealistic and not probable, right? So, because there were so many factors that went into every single meet that I swam. And I remember going up to my coaches and saying, like, why does this feel so hard? Like, why is it every time I dive into the water when it comes to a meet, like my muscles are immediately just like tense, they feel heavy, when every single day, like every weekday, I would practice for 2.5 hours, maybe some 5 total in a day, and they never felt that heavy. It wasn't until later in my life where I really learned about the mind-body connection that my muscles were responding to the intensity of those thoughts of like, you have to be perfect, you know, coach will be mad, mom will be mad. My parents never put pressure on me to ever do anything, right? But in my mind, it was, I don't want to let them down. I don't want to disappoint them. So therefore, I must be perfect and on it every single time, or therefore, you know, all their time, effort, and energy isn't going to mean anything because I'm not like holding up my end of the bargain, right? None of that was ever said to me, but that's what came to me, is like, I have to be perfect. And so that's where I talk about the mind-body connection, is that your body will respond to the intensity of your thoughts. So if your thoughts are so like down in the weeds, or I'm not good enough, or I have to be perfect, or if I don't do this, then X won't happen, or X will happen. That's the mind-body connection. And that's why, you know, we really work with athletes to shift that mindset, because it will actually make performance easier, or at least feel easier, without all of that mental intensity translating to physical intensity.
I love that you just shared all of that. Like, obviously, thank you, because being vulnerable like that, and I'm sure you've shared this story many times, you know, to help athletes. So maybe it's not as vulnerable feeling for you anymore. Yet we don't realize how common that is for folks, just to have that critic in your head. And I think it's so great that you can recognize, because that's one of the questions I usually ask my clients, is like, whose voice is that, right? Like, where did that come from? And oftentimes it is parents or society, but I love that you pointed out, nobody really told me that. It was my own pressure I was putting on myself. And I think we can become like conditioned, right? Even, you know, I think of like Pavlov's dogs, right? Like, you know, you see your family smiling and clapping and, you know, celebrating you when you do perform well. So of course we're like, okay, how do I recreate that outcome again? Because it feels really good. And when I perform, I definitely get it, right? I love that so much. All right, let's get into this inner opponent, because I love the name that you've titled it, because in therapy world, we have so many different, right? Like that negative self-talk, we have so many inner critic, we have so many different titles for it. But let's talk about that invisible opponent and how you see it kind of impact student athletes, and what you do with them to help shift that.
Yeah. Well, it's just like you said, it's like, where does that voice come from? We all have this inner opponent in us, you know, and part of it, you know, inner critic, gremlin, you know, whatever, it comes with 967 different names. But, you know, a part of that is innate and just our humanity, right? Part of that has to do with how we evolved and, you know, as a species to survive, right? We had to know that there was fear out there so that we didn't go taking so many risks that we, you know, dissipated the species. But what's happening now is that, you know, our brain hasn't necessarily evolved enough to know that, like, hey, we're not standing in front of this huge creature that's trying to kill us, right? We're now standing in front of a soccer game or a swimming game or a swimming meet or a basketball game, whatever the case may be. And our brain is putting the same or similar kind of fear alerts in that respect. And, you know, we're translating physical fear to psychological fear. And so that's when our brain fills in the gaps, right? Because it's still trying to stay alive, still trying to perpetuate the species, right? And, you know, I think every athlete, particularly those at the highest levels who want, and that's who we work with, right? Those who want to take their talents to college or potentially even beyond. They may have, you know, dreams beyond that. And that's where that pressure comes from, in terms of, hey, if I'm here at 15 years old and I do X, Y, or Z, oh my gosh, that may mean like, hey, that might mess up college chances, or that might mess up, you know, whatever I may have planned or want after college. And, you know, we just draw attention to that voice, one, to bring awareness that it's there, right? And then we really work to help them understand it's not you, right? When we hear that voice, it's like, yeah, you know, Amanda, as you said, it's like we go to the like, oh, I get people like me when I perform really well. So then our brain fills in, well, if I don't perform really well, people won't like me, right? There's that like black and white version to it. And that's where our inner opponent kind of fills in those gaps for us, when really it's filling in a gap that it just hasn't yet been able to process, of like, oh, wait, if I don't perform really well, no one's really mad at me, or, you know, whatever the case may be. But we build that inner pressure or that inner negative self-talk because we don't want to be excluded or not liked, or, you know, whatever, again, gap our brain can fill for us. That's really kind of what that inner opponent is. It's like trying to keep you safe, But that protection is misguided is what we talk about.
And I
Yeah, I
love
talk-
how you
Okay.
mentioned, oh, sorry, Amanda. We do that to each other. I just love how you said, like, because the first step is always building awareness. It's like, so if I don't know, so I do a lot of schema work and I do a lot of like parts work with my clients and like my own clinical practice. And when I hear all of, the language and stuff you're using, and Amanda and I, we use the figure of speech, like there's not an actual tiger in the room with us, but something about this feels familiar because it's it feels like something I have to navigate. There's a lot of pressure, expectation, so our brain's like, that means we're not safe. So I do a lot of work with my clients on like building awareness, and then how do I build a foundation of like, this is uncomfortable, this is really overwhelming, but I'm not unsafe. Like I'm safe. And then kind of going from there into a whole thing that I don't have to do in this moment. But I love that you mentioned like the first step is building awareness, because I think if you don't kind of befriend it and be curious about like what the beginning process of that is, like what's happening, I feel like then you can just very quickly just then meet it with more criticalness and like, oh my gosh, why, this is happening again. Why am I so anxious? Like, apparently I suck. I shouldn't be doing this. And it's like, but if you can like just separate from it and see that it's there first, then you can, that's where I think the perception shift can happen. And I love even way back. I like that you took it way back to like, this is happening for a very human needed reason. Language is apparently hard for me Sunday mornings. It's important, and it's happening because you do care so much. But how do we harness it and use it differently and regulate it better?
And that becomes one of the biggest challenges with athletes, is that there is that caring so much, right? It's like where the love of the game or sport becomes identity, because that's what happened for me. It was like, oh, I love swimming. I'm very good at swimming. It just came naturally to me. This is where I feel a lot of joy and fun and a lot like me. So if I don't do well, and again, at 15 or 16, I wasn't conscious of this, but as I look back, I was like, okay, well, if I don't do well, and what does that mean about me as a person? And I was so wrapped up because I loved it so much. It wasn't because I mean, obviously I wanted to do really well but do the best that I possibly could, but it was like, I couldn't figure out how to create that healthy separation.
You're so on point, Lauren. And I think like back to survival, I love that you pointed out like we need it for survival, and that our brain, like society has developed way beyond what our primal part of our brain has, right? But then also this importance of human connection, and we are a pack species. Like we've talked about this on so many episodes of like, we are a pack species. We don't want to be outcast, right? We want to be a part of the group for survival because we need that. But then also thinking about the people that you're working with that age developmentally, it's all about your peers and fitting in, right? Like, so you saying, okay, I'm a swimmer, this is who I am, but if I'm not a swimmer, who am I? Where do I fit in? What peer, right? Like that is so crucial to that age as well.
Yeah. And that was the thing. Like I lived in two separate worlds, right? I had my swimming friends who clearly I could relate to, and, we were going through the same things, and we just had a lot of those shared experiences. And then I had my school friends, which we were doing the same thing, but I didn't feel as tied to them in some ways. And so I always felt like an outcast in the school friends versus my swimming friends. And I always felt that I was like being like pulled in both directions, because I wanted to be, not that I was unaccepted by my school friends, I just didn't know how to fit in a great way. And so it was this constant like, well, if I'm over here with my swimming friends and I'm missing out on school friends, I have school friends, I'm missing out. So, it was like this back and forth of it. And again, it was like kind of tied to my identity. If I start hanging with my school friends, what does that mean with my swimming friend? And it was just it was a complete mind cluster, quite honestly. And then as I got older and, as I ended high school, that's when I started to maybe, you know, pull a little bit more away from sport just for a short time before I went to college, just to kind of create, like, close out my identity in that sort of way with like a nice, well, what I thought was a nice little bow tie, but I think it just confused me more, quite honestly.
You do what you can with what you have in the moment, you know?
Exactly. It's like, I don't know what to do with this. But you know, I think there are times when, and regardless if you're an athlete or not, I think we all kind of go through this, like when something is tied to our identity, that's when the inner opponent can scream so loudly, because it's like, well, wait a minute, if you try to shift or find or fill a gap differently than what you've done before, that's when it'll like start screaming, well, who are you? What value will you have? Yeah, like,
Yeah.
like what value will you have if you're not a swimmer? Or insert whatever label you've given yourself in that respect.
So good, because I think that's such a crucial point too. Like, it relates to so many areas. Obviously, it relates to this work. It relates to mindset. It relates to any level of change you're trying to do. It relates to therapy, people trying to use new coping skills. Like, this stuff does not happen overnight because it wasn't built overnight. That, right? So like, I love what you said. As soon as you said that, like, right, you're going to try to do something different. And I just imagine like the full engine brakes are on. It's like, hold on. Even though this is like what I share with my clients, like, your brain is so smart, but it's dug this route over and over and over and over again for years, right? And even though it's bumpy and it's kind of dark and creepy and it's not so fun along the way, your brain's always going to go that way initially because it's what it knows. As you're trying to create new paths, it's going to be like, I don't know what's out there. There's unknown. Even though the stuff over here isn't great, I at least know what to expect, right? Yes. So just to validate, when you're trying to change anything, your brain is going to have some hesitation for that, again, for survival.
It's so smart, but it's kind of lazy.
Yeah.
Isn't that like that so much? I might start using that. You know, our brains are real smart, but sometimes
they're kind of lazy, right? They love the routine, you know, because and it makes sense, right? If you're thinking about how the brain works, and again, I don't know that we're ever really gonna know how the brain truly works.
Intricate, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, think about just the number of neurons and pathways and this and that, and how they're all interconnected, or maybe not, or whatever the case may be. Like, it wants ease, because if we were to have to rethink or redo every experience we had, our brain would it would be exhausted. And so that's where it gets quote unquote lazy, is that it creates those pathways. And it's like, Amanda, what you said, it may not be the greatest, it may be painful, I don't necessarily like it, but it's what I know, so I'm just going to keep going and keep going and keep going. And that's when the change comes. That's when it's your brain. That's why sometimes I think, at least for me, it's like my brain is a little jumbled of, like, you know, you put the brakes on the pathway that you've created and you're like, no, we're going to take a slight right at this point. And that's where your brain kind of gets a little like, wait a minute. But the moment that you hold yourself accountable to the consistency of turning right at that moment, that's when you'll kind of have the groove there, create a new groove. And that's where like your brain's quote unquote laziness can come in handy.
Right. And the huge conversations that we have, multiple episodes, my own client sessions, also with myself, is always, you know, pairing that with a lot of self-compassion, because it's like, hey, that's kept me safe. That path, you know, has kept me safe for a long time. That's been the thing. That's what I've done, you know. And then now I have to be easy on myself. Like we said, that doesn't form overnight. And I think it's one of the biggest, it's like the kryptonite of our inner opponent, kind of. It's like a self-compassion and telling myself, like, I see my clients, like, I see like a physical relief whenever I have the conversation with them about like neuroplasticity, that you can, it's hard, it's not easy, but you can build these pathways. And you can, you know, figure out an alternative route. And then whenever I tell them, like, those things aren't things to be judged, the path that I've been taking, the perspective that I've had, like, those served a purpose, but now I'm building awareness that like it's actually causing me dysfunction. And maybe before it wasn't. That's what I did. It got me through, but now I have to be able to see that. So I pair those a lot. And I hear that in your language as well.
Yeah.
And I think I know our listeners and even myself, I'm excited to hear some like concrete, like the 3 simple ways to start the mental training. And if you have tips for people that they can implement, whether or not they're athletes, but just when they notice their own inner opponent.
Yeah. Yeah. I think first and foremost, well, there's like 3 kind of like principles, quote unquote. And then, when you talk about steps, so the principles is what you just said, like cutting yourself some slack. That's always what we talk about with athletes, is that, a lot of athletes, humans, let's just talk about humans. A lot of times we equate cutting ourselves some slack or giving ourselves grace or, insert whatever words you want to use as weakness. Well, like if I'm easy on myself, then what growth am I really going through, or whatever the case may be? Or will people, right, going back to the tribal thing, like what everyone see me as weak if I like give myself a little bit of a moment. But because we as humans tend to put so much internal pressure on ourselves, right? We're filling in gaps that our brain hasn't yet figured out how to process. That's where the internal pressure comes from. And so first and foremost, the first principle is like, be okay with cutting yourself some slack, right? At some moment, you have to relieve some pressure in order to find growth. So, finding that grace for yourself. The second principle is about embracing the hard work. There's always that, kind of debate of like, you see a lot these days of like, life doesn't have to be hard. And, if we find our, ease, and yes, I totally believe in that. But at the same time, it's life. Like things are going to be hard. And if we can embrace that and the idea of optimism versus positivity, right? Optimism is being able to say, hey, today may not be my day, but I know as I work through this, I will find my day. Whereas positivity is, we're just going to put a smile on our face and just keep going. And, there can be some dismissive kind of behavior or intent when we're overly positive versus being optimistic. And then the third principle is asking for support. Like, allow yourself, Amanda, you were talking about before, the vulnerability to find support, right? And I always talk about this with athletes too, because a lot of athletes believe, and this is from own personal experience, like if I got myself into this mess, I've got to be the one to get myself out, right? There's that idea that personal responsibility swings so far to one side of the pendulum without recognizing there is no athlete on this planet, no human on this planet really, that one is an individual. Like think about it from a sports standpoint, individual sport. It doesn't exist. Like even as a swimmer, even though I was out there swimming on my own and I was the one who had to complete the race, I had an entire team behind me. We scored as a team. Like we did all these things as a team. And then, think about it from the greatest athletes on the planet. Michael Jordan had a coach. Tiger Woods has a coach. Tom Brady has a coach. Like there's no one out there who does anything on their own. So those are kind of the 3 principles. So when you take that, like some of the tangible steps about identifying your inner opponent or dealing with your inner opponent, one of the first things that we do to bring awareness is like, give it a name, like separate it from yourself. And in some ways, do not equate it with someone, right? So, because that way you don't want to kind of like blend the lines or blur the lines of that person and your inner opponent. Now, while that person may have contributed to some of the things you hear from your inner opponent, right? Finding a way to like break that connection in some way, so that when you start to hear that voice or that inner opponent, you can say, oh, hey, Pete, I'm just making that up, that protection, while very valuable, has been very valuable, I don't really need it today, right? And you can create kind of that separation from the inner opponent. The other one that we talk about with athletes is like, try to identify its loudest message. Your inner opponent may have more than one message. Mine is, it used to be when I was younger, you don't have a voice worthy of being heard. So I had a really hard time like finding my voice. But I think the one that's really loudest for me is the more you do, the more people will like you. So I'm a doer, I'm an achiever, right? A lot of that comes from obviously the world I grew up in, right? As you were saying before, Amanda, people liked you and you did really well. So keep doing well, keep doing things.
I don't relate to that at all. I don't know what
I know, right? Who does? I'm the only, of the 8 billion, I'm the only one, right? So like looking at identifying its message. And then the third is there's always a yin and a yang to life. There's always a balance. So you have this inner opponent, which means you also have the converse. You have the inner coach. You have the ability to find that more optimistic, positive message if you embrace the hard work of stopping that inner opponent's message and reframing it from an inner coach's point of view.
I love that.
I got
little chills. Yeah.
Awesome. I was like, that's a brilliant read. I have to say it, but my brain is saying to just say it. That it's not black and white though. Like I feel like that's a brilliant way of saying, because our brains love to think in black and white.
Yes.
But it's like how they're opposites, but it's more focused on like capability rather than like deficiency or lack of or like incapable. Like, so I love that you have the inner opponent in you. That's very clear. That's the loudest. That's our default. But the one also is right there too.
Yeah, and I love that you
Thank
say
you for
like
that.
we have to acknowledge it first, right? Like Kelsi said, because this is where we could get into like toxic positivity, where you're just like, no, it's fine. We're great. Everything's okay. And you just go full on coach, right? And we don't recognize like, oh, I'm being really hard on myself. Okay, that makes sense. Because like when I was a kid, I really looked for that. Okay, right. But right now that's not serving, right? Like it's not just like, F off, inner critic. I'm coming over to the coach side, right?
Yes.
Like, I think we also have to distinguish that for people. Again, it's a learning process and it takes time and it's delicate because also like Kelsi and I do a lot of inner child healing too. So like you have to be really delicate with these things, because if you're very dismissive of that inner child that's tugging at your leg, whining, and you're just like, go away, I don't have time for this because I got to perform, that's going to cause more long-term detrimental effects as well.
Yeah. And I will say sometimes with working with athletes, there's not always time in the moment to dig a little bit deeper, right? Particularly if you're starting to like feel those things or experience those things during a game or a meet or a race. And so, we do work with them to say, hey, Amanda, what you were just saying, like, hey, find what you can in that moment to perform to the best of your ability, but come back. Right? Take some time after, because one of the things, this like hit me like a ton of bricks. I had the opportunity to actually talk to an Olympic gold medalist swimmer. It was like the greatest day of my life. And this person said a lot of athletes, I think when it was mentioned, it was like swimmers, but athletes in general can be overdeveloped in resilience. That get really good at when you're knocked down, getting right back up and just moving on without taking time to realize what the knocking down did to you in that moment and potentially where it came from, so that you can take that lesson learned and apply it moving forward. So with athletes, we try to find that balance sometimes of like, okay, deal with it in the moment, get through what you can, but be very intentional about coming back to it.
I was just going to ask you if you had any closing words as we're wrapping up here. And I think that was it. Like come back to like compartmentalize, because you have to perform in the moment. It's like, yeah, if the tiger's standing in front of you, you don't have time to be like, why am I afraid? Let's process this, right? Like you gotta be like, oh, I'm afraid. Okay, like don't suppress it, put it on a shelf and come back to it later, right? Oh, so good. Okay, where can people find you if they want to learn more about you, your services, all that good stuff?
Yeah, so you can find us at performancereimagined.com. That's our website. And then on Instagram at performance_reimagined_. And we've got some really cool things in the works. So we work, full transparency, on a fiscal year. So we try to align that to the school year. And since I'm in Ohio, that's like mid-August to late August, and that might be some September for some places. But we've got some really cool things rolling out for student athletes to do a lot of mental training on their own time, at their own pace, but also provide a community to connect with other student athletes.
This is such a needed service and resource. So thank you, Lauren.
Well, thank you.
I knew as soon as you came and spoke that I needed to have you on the podcast. So thank you for being here. And we welcome you back if you'd love to come and talk on another topic. However, you're very niched. So, we could always go at different aspects of this topic as well.
For sure.
All right, for our audience, make sure that you subscribe, subscribe and turn on your notifications so you are always notified when the latest episodes are coming out. Next week, we're having another person from our networking group. I'm sure Lauren knows, Monica Tuck.
Oh,
and
yes.
She's going to be talking about, which the title is so ironic given the name of my organization, but it's Carving Out Your Own Career Path. So super excited to welcome her next week. So make sure you tune into that, and we will see you next time. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.